Marshal Martello Chapter 2. The Nightshaders. Sawtooth continued moving at the same slow frontier rhythm it always had. Wagons rolled through town, and if the Nightshaders existed, they left no obvious trace of themselves. But the name began to surface in quiet ways. One evening in the saloon, a ranch hand leaned against a bar and muttered to no one in particular. Seen riders escorting wagons through the hills again last night. Didn't stop in town. Didn't say a word. Wise Whiskey, wiping down a glass, gave a small grunt. The same group of travelers keeps coming through every couple of weeks. They never stay long, always pay in cash and keep to themselves. A trader named Jackie Durango, sitting a few stools down, spoke up without looking from his drink. Funny thing is, some of those shipments clear inspection faster than they should. Like somebody already knows what's in the wagons before they even get here. Martello, who had been listening quietly from the end of the bar, finally spoke. You ever ask why? Jackie gave a short, humorless laugh. Asking questions around here ain't exactly good for business, Marshal. Wise Whiskey set a fresh glass in front of Martello without being asked. Some things move through this town whether folks ask about them or not. The question is whether you want to be the one who starts looking too close. None of those details proved anything on their own, but taken together, they formed something Martello had learned to recognize. A pattern. The more he listened, the clearer the shape of that pattern became. The Nightshaders were not operating like ordinary outlaws. They did not rob travelers or attack shipments. In fact, most people in Sawtooth had never seen them directly at all. Their business depended on something far quieter than violence. Movement. It was the kind of operation that only worked when people stopped asking questions, and Sawtooth had grown comfortable doing exactly that. While the name slowly surfaced in Sawtooth County, another place began appearing alongside it in Martello's investigation. Kansas City. At first, the connection seemed ordinary. Kansas City was larger than Sawtooth and served as a major crossroads for trade across the region. Rail shipments arrived there from distant ports, and freight wagons departed, carrying goods toward the interior territories. It was exactly the sort of place where supplies, cargo, and travelers naturally passed through before reaching smaller towns. But something about the traffic between Kansas City and Sawtooth did not sit right with Martello. Freight manifests arriving from Kansas City awfully showed small inconsistencies, weights that didn't match the wagons carrying them, items listed vaguely enough to avoid inspection, delivery arriving hours before their paperwork suggested they should have. Most of these irregularities were minor on their own. In another town, they may have been dismissed as sloppy bookkeeping. Martello had spent too many years chasing smugglers to believe in sloppy coincidences. The deeper he looked, the clearer it became that Sawtooth was not the beginning of the problem, it was the middle. Kansas City appeared again and again in the background of the shipments Martello was examining. Wagons left the rail depots there and arrived in Sawtooth carrying freight that no one seemed eagerly appear to examine too closely. From Sawtooth, those goods often continued further west, breaking apart into smaller shipments carried by riders who quietly traveled through the surrounding hills. What Martello was looking at was not a single criminal operation. It was a network that relied on cooperation rather than violence. Freight agents signed paperwork without asking questions, traders moved certain goods for the right price, and occasionally men wearing a badge ensured the wrong wagon was never inspected too carefully. The arrest of Jessie Morgan had not created that network. It had only revealed that it existed. Martello had no doubt that Morgan was involved. The deputy's frequent rides outside of Kansas City, his unexplained money, and the way certain shipments moved through town without interference all pointed in the same direction. Martello was likely protecting loads. Morgan was likely protecting loads as they passed through Sawtooth County, possibly even moving product himself when the opportunity arose. He was not the source of the operation, but he was useful to someone close enough to the law to keep problems from surfacing, yet far enough from the center to be replaced if needed. What Martello did not yet understand was how deeply that system had rooted itself in the town surrounding Sawtooth, or how many powerful men had grown wealthy by allowing it to continue undisturbed. For years, the arrangement had functioned quietly, almost peacefully. But the moment a United States Marshal began asking questions, the balance that protected it began to shift. Somewhere behind the respectable storefronts and freight offices of Kansas City, the people who benefited from that balance were beginning to realize that Martello might become a problem they could not afford to ignore. The arrest of Jessie Morgan did not cause an immediate stir in Sawtooth County. On the surface, the town absorbed the news in the same way the frontier towns absorb most unpleasant developments, with a brief round of quiet conversation and a return to ordinary business. A deputy had been caught where he should not have been. A fine had been issued, and the matter had been recorded according to federal procedure. For most people in town, that was enough of an explanation to move on. But trouble on the frontier rarely announced itself with spectacle. It moved slowly, the way rot moves through wood at first, until almost invisible until the structure supporting it begins to weaken. In the days following Morgan's arrest, Martello noticed subtle shifts that experienced lawmen learned to watch for. Conversations in saloons that ended a little sooner when he stepped through the door. Freight clerks became careful with their words. Men who had been perfectly comfortable speaking with him a week earlier now offered short answers and found reasons to leave the room. It was not panic, it was caution. Someone had begun paying attention. The first person bold enough to approach him directly did so under circumstances that appeared entirely accidental. Martello was crossing the main street of Sawtooth late one afternoon when a woman stepped out from a general store and nearly collided with him. She paused, offering an apologetic smile that came easily and felt practiced. "Pardon me," she said, her voice carrying a soft southern drawl that made even simple words sound warm. "I wasn't watching where I was going." Martello touched the brim of his hat. "No harm done." She studied him for a brief moment, then tilted her head slightly. "You must be Marshal Martello. I've heard your name around town." He gave a small nod. "And you are?" "Eleanor Jane Morgan," she replied, extending a gloved hand. Her grip was light but steady. "Jessie's wife." Martello shook her hand once, then released it. "Miss Morgan?" She gave a small, rueful laugh. "I suppose you've been thinking all sorts of things about my husband lately. It's been quite the talk, hasn't it? These small towns do love their rumors. Sometimes I think half stories aren't true. They just grow legs on their own." Martello watched her carefully. "Misunderstandings happen." "They do," she agreed, her smile never quite reaching her eyes, "especially when people are quick to judge. Jessie's always been a hard worker. A little ambitious, maybe, but that's hardly a crime." "I imagine being a marshal means you have to look at all kinds of stories," Eleanor said, her tone light but measured. "It must get tiring having to sort through what's real and what's just people talking." "It's part of the job," Martello replied. She gave a small, sympathetic laugh. "I suppose it is. Still, it's a shame when a man's reputation gets dragged through the mud over a misunderstanding. I hate to think anyone was being unfair to him, especially when he's only tried to do right by his town." Martello watched her carefully but said nothing. Eleanor let the moment settle, as if giving him space to respond. When he didn't, she shifted the subject with practiced ease. "You know, I have a sister named Anna Jane. She's far too bright and kind for most of the men in this town. I've often thought she could use the company of someone respectable. A man with a steady hand and a clear head." She glanced at him, the suggestion hanging lightly between them, half joking, half serious. Martello's expression didn't change. "I'm sure your sister can find her own company." Eleanor's smile lingered a second longer than necessary. "Perhaps. Still, it never hurts to make a good introduction." She took a small step back. "I won't keep you, Marshal. I'm sure you have important work to do." She turned and walked away without another word, her posture relaxed and unhurried. Martello remained where he stood, watching her go. He saw it clearly now. Every word had been deliberate. She had tested how much he knew about her husband, softened the arrest as a simple misunderstanding, then pivoted it to her sister as a distraction, or perhaps another angle altogether. Nothing about the conversation had been accidental. By the time she had disappeared around the corner, he already knew one thing for certain. Running into Eleanor Jane Morgan on that street had not been an accident. The conversation with Eleanor Jane Morgan lingered in Martello's mind longer than most casual conversations did. That alone told him it had not been casual at all. People rarely approached a federal marshal days after the arrest of their husband unless they wanted something. For several days he let the matter sit. Then he began asking quiet questions where it would not be noticed. One afternoon he stopped by the freight office underneath the pretense of checking under a manifest. The clerk, a nervous man with ink-stained fingers, glanced around before speaking. "Miss Morgan's been in here a fair bit lately," he said. "Always asking about shipments, who's bringing what in, when things do, what causes never causes trouble, but she asks a lot of questions for someone who ain't in the business." Martello gave a small nod. "She say why?" The clerk shrugged. "She says she's just keeping an eye on things for her husband. But Jessie ain't been around much since, well, you know." Later in the saloon, Martello spoke briefly with Wise Whiskey while the bar was quiet. "Eleanor Morgan," Martello said simply. Wise Whiskey wiped down a glass and kept his voice low. "She gets around, knows most of the traders, a few of the boys who move freight, some of the deputies who ain't always where they're supposed to be. She's got a way of making people talk without them realizing they're saying too much." Martello didn't reply. He simply listened. Over the next few days, the picture grew clearer. Eleanor Jane Morgan moved through Sawtooth's social circles with ease. She knew the freight agents, the saloon owners, and the traders moving goods through town. She also seemed familiar with more than a few deputies who spent their time elsewhere where they should have been working. Then there was the sister. Unlike Eleanor, Anna Jane rarely came up in conversation. When she did, it was usually in passing. Someone's younger sister, quiet, polite, harmless enough. She helped around the town where she could, kept mostly to herself, and seemed to exist largely in the shadow of her more outgoing sibling. That contrast stayed with Martello. Men who operated quiet criminal enterprises often placed people exactly where they appeared least suspicious. A charming sister to draw attention, a quiet sister no one bothered watching. He told himself he was only testing the idea. A few days later, he sent a short note through one of the boys who ran errands for a few coins. The message was simple, polite, and just ambiguous enough to appear genuine. "Miss Eleanor, you mentioned your sister the other afternoon. If she would be agreeable, I might enjoy making her acquaintance properly. A ride outside town, perhaps. M. Martello." It was bait. If Eleanor had approached him intentionally, the response would reveal something about how the game was being played. The answer came back the following morning that Anna Jane would be delighted. Martello saddled Albino Warrior late the following afternoon and met Anna just outside the town where the road began stretching into open country. She arrived riding a modest bay mare that looked well cared for but far less impressive than Martello's pale stallion. Anna herself appeared exactly as people had described, pleasant enough, a little nervous, and carrying none of the calculated confidence her sister possessed. If Eleanor had been as sweet as honey, Anna was something closer to plain sugar water. They rode slowly along the foothills, following a wandering trail couples often used when they wanted to talk without the whole world watching. Martello allowed the conversation to drift naturally, giving Anna the space to speak while he listened. She filled the silence easily. "My sister says you've been very busy since you got here," Anna said after a while, glancing at him. "She mentioned something about freight and, well, I don't really understand all that, but she said you've been asking a lot of questions around town." Martello kept his eyes on the trail. "It's part of the job." Anna nodded as if explained everything. A moment later, she tried again. "Do you think you'll be staying in Sawtooth long? Do they move your marshals around a lot?" "Depends on the work," Martello replied. She gave a small nervous laugh. "Jessie used to say the same thing. Always said you never really knew where the job would take you." She hesitated, then added, He really never talked much about what he did. Not with me, anyway. Martello didn't respond. They rode a little further before Anna spoke again, her voice lighter this time. My sister thinks I should get out more, meet new people. She said you seemed respectable. She glanced at him again. Do you think that's true? That I should be meeting more people? Martello kept his tone even. That's for you to decide. Anna felt quiet for a short while, but it didn't last. When they reached a bend on the trail that offered a view of the hills, she pulled her horse to a stop. It's getting late, she said, though the sun was still well above the horizon. I should probably start heading back. Kansas City's a long ride. Martello nodded. Safe travels. Anna offered a small, uncertain smile. It was nice meeting you, Marshal. Maybe we'll run into each other again sometime. Maybe. She turned her mare and rode off in the direction of Kansas City without another word. Martello watched her go for a moment, then turned albino warrior back towards Sawtooth. By the time the sun began sinking in the hills, he had quietly concluded something he would rarely admit out loud. He had gambled wrong. The ride to Sawtooth was quiet, but Martello's mind was not. He thought about Anna Jane and how nervous she had been, how little she seemed to know, and how easily Eleanor had used her. He thought about the note he had sent and how quickly it had been answered. He thought about Eleanor's smile, her careful words, and the way she steered every part of their conversation. He was still turning it over when albino warrior's ears twitched. Martello felt the stallion tense between him. A second before he heard the sound himself, hooves, more than one rider, moving with purpose. The men stepped out from the rocks on either side of the narrow trail as if they had been waiting. 4 of them, all wearing dark coats and scarves pulled high across their faces. No badges, no need for them. The quiet certainty in the way they sat on their horses told Martello exactly who they were. Nightshaders. One man, slightly ahead of the others, rested his forearm on the saddle horn and spoke in a calm, unharried voice. Marshal Martello. Martello kept his hands still. 4 rifles were already angled in his direction. You've been asking questions, the man continued. Questions make people uncomfortable. Another rider nudged his horse forward a step. This town works better when things stay the way they are, when folks mind their own business. The first man tilted his head slightly. You've got a reputation for being thorough. That's fine, so long as you know where to stop. Some trails don't need following. Some questions don't need answers. Martello studied them for a moment and then spoke. And if I keep asking? The man gave a small, almost amused shrug. Then you'll keep finding the same type of trouble. Only next time, we might not be so polite about it. Martello opened his mouth to reply when the first shot cracked across the canyon. The ambush was sudden and brutal. Martello drew one revolver and fired, catching one of the riders high in the chest and knocking him from the saddle. A second man slammed into him from the side, the impact driving him from albino warrior's back. The stallion reared as another rifle fired, as the world turned to dust, hooves, and chaos. When it was over, Martello lay flat on his back, staring up at the darkened sky. The nightshaders were already gone. They hadn't tried to kill him. They hadn't needed to. The point had been made. By the time Martello rode slowly back into Sawtooth, the town had already settled into its usual quiet nightly rhythm. Lamps glowed softly behind saloon windows. A few wagons creaked down the street, their drivers nodding politely as they passed. Nothing in the calm, ordinary sense suggested that violence had unfolded only a few miles away in the hills. The frontier had always been good at pretending nothing had happened. He dismounted in front of the marshal's office without a word to anyone. Albino warrior stood patiently as Martello loosened the cinch and brushed a hand along the stallion's neck. The horse's white coat was still dusted from the dirt from the scuffle, but the animal remained calm, as though the ambush had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Inside the office, Martello hung his hat on the peg, the old Civil War badge catching the lamplight for a moment. He sat down heavily at the desk. For a long time he simply stared at the wall, replaying the rider's words, the crack of the first shot, the way they had melted back into the hills without finishing the job. Later that night, when the town had gone even quieter, the soft sound of a banjo drifted out through the open window. Martello sat alone at his desk, the instrument resting across his knee. His fingers moved slowly across the strings, pulling out a low, thoughtful melody. It wasn't a happy tune, nor a sad one. It was something in between, the kind of music a man played when he needed time to think, when the weight of the day refused to settle. The Nightshaders had sent their message, clear, measured, professional. But Martello had learned something important in return. If they were willing to risk revealing themselves, to step out of the shadows and warn him directly, then the trail he had started following was already closer to the truth than they were comfortable with. He continued playing. The notes drifted into the cool night air. Martello had never been the sort of man to look back once the trail began to get interesting. Coming soon, Marshal Martello, Chapter 3, The United States Marshal Service.